Again, hi everybody. Welcome. I'm so pleased to see all of you. I'm proud to be presenting the Aspen Brain Lab for the third year in a row. And I'm especially proud to be presenting Aspen Brain Lab because unraveling the mysteries of the brain has become a national priority. And locally, we have become a growing community right here of global seekers interested in all things brainy. So I'm really thrilled to see all of you here today, and especially people who have come every year. I think I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Glenda Greenwald, president of the Aspen Brain Forum and Aspen Brain Lab. I want to start with a few thank yous. I want to thank my colleague and co-organizer, Joseph Dial, who is right there. Joseph is the chair of our scientific advisory board of the Aspen Brain Forum. Joseph and I produce one scientific and technical conference every year with the New York Academy of Sciences in New York, and we also co-produce Aspen Brain Lab. It turns out that I know about a third of the great neuroscientists in the world, but Joseph knows the other 2/3. And his other great skill is that he can talk serious neuroscience and drink at the same time. And he's often required to do that. You'll hear more from Joseph in a little bit. Next, a big thank you to Zia Hux. Zia, I don't know if you're here, you're probably out front. But Zia is the project manager. We have a really small staff, that would be Zia and me. And Zia is the project manager for Aspen Brain Lab, and she does a great job for us every year. Another big thank you to Carol Lee and Lynn. Carol Lee Friedlander and Lynn, where are you? They have brought 65 women from all over the country and maybe from all over the world, because last year I know you brought six women from South Africa. Anybody from out of the country this time? India, thank you and welcome all of the Access Circles. I also want to thank 3 groups who have brought some outstanding students: the Aspen Science Center, the HS Squared, and the Boogies Buddy Program. We gave lots of kids scholarships and welcome all the young kids. They really love this stuff. I want to tell you about our tiny program books. So have all of you received a tiny program book? No? Well, they were to be given out, and that's the only way you'll know the program, and they're outside if you need one. But they're very tiny. And I wanted to just explain that they're tiny because the speakers gave us long biographies that were more like memoirs for their grandchildren. And so we couldn't put them in the tiny program book. So please know that you can go online, aspenbrainlab.com, and you can look up the long biographies. So if you wouldn't mind shutting off your phones, so there's no texting and no sexting, as if I know what that means, but I was told to say it. Okay. Sexting in this hour. So just a couple of words, and then I'm going to introduce our first speaker. A journalist asked me recently why people should come to the Aspen Brain Lab. And I said, I think there are a few reasons. Number one, we are all seekers. And as I said, a growing community of 21st century global seekers. We are also all biohackers. And you will find out more about what that means when some of our next speakers come up. It means that we're really looking for the latest science-based information on how we can live a longer life, a healthier life, a life of pure potential and optimal performance. Does anybody disagree with that? None of us are stingy in asking for the good life, so we're going to get little bits of it today. Also, because staying informed is not nerdy. And if it is nerdy, I think all of us might say we're glad to be nerds for the day. So welcome. My mission for the Aspen Brain Lab is like that of Peter Diamandis in his book, Abundance. To get us out of our linear brain and into our exponential brain, and to start reinventing, rethinking, and reimagining healthy brains and mind and future brains and mind. Oh, please turn off the phones. We're going to start with the first section of our program, Creative Brain. And you know that we humans are born with a capacity to create a future. In fact, we can create many futures. And all of that is based on the unique human power of imagination. Someone who has achieved this faculty and much more is our next speaker, Walter Isaacson. He's president of the Aspen Institute and the recipient and the author of numerous award-winning books. So most of you know that about Walter. Well, there's something I didn't know about Walter. I had asked Walter 6 months ago to speak for us, and he graciously accepted. And only recently at dinner, I mentioned what his time slot was, which was, what would that be, 7:45? And he was very shocked, because what I didn't know is that Walter is a night owl, and he's a writing night owl, and we have obviously interrupted this a little bit. Something I do know about Walter is that he's a very important man who writes about important lives and important matters. So it's my honor and privilege to present Walter, a slightly sleep-deprived, but coping beautifully, Walter Isaacson.
Thank you, Glenda, and thank you for what you do. It's great to be back at Brain Lab for the third year. And the importance of Brain Lab is that we all know a lot of very brainy people, and we think brainy people are supposed to be smart. But after a while, you meet brainy people and people who are smart, and you realize that smart people are a dime a dozen, and that they don't usually amount to much. What really matters is what we're talking about today throughout this program, which is being creative. And it's a creative brain that always trumps just the brainy brain. It's a creative brain that can think differently, think out of the box, and make connections. In fact, as you look at the difference between brains and machines outstrip us all the time in mental processing power. They can go through algorithms at, thousands or millions of times faster than we can. But what the human brain can do is make connections, do creative things. And that's what I want to talk about today, because the creativity and innovation that come from the human brain, I think can come from three different traits. They all begin with the letter C. I didn't mean to make it gimmicky, but it's about connections, it's about collaboration, and it's about doing things that are particularly creative that come from curiosity. And so to start with the notion of connections, I'll start with a wonderful woman who was the person who first came up with the notion of a general-purpose computer and first wrote an algorithm for a computer. Somewhat lost to history, this woman, but she was one of the most creative people of the modern age. In the early 1800s, Ada Byron, the Countess of Lovelace, was Lord Byron's daughter. And from that birth, she got a creative streak of poetry. Like her father, she loved romantic poetry. But those of you who know anything about Lord Byron can imagine that Lady Byron, his wife, was not particularly fond of Lord Byron by the time Ada was growing up. He was a little bit too much of a romantic poet. And so Lady Byron tutored Ada solely in mathematics, as if understanding math would be an antidote that would prevent you from being romantic or being poetic. As it turns out, Ada makes the connection, the most important connection we humans make, the connection between arts and sciences. And she creates what she calls poetical science. Her father was a Luddite, and I mean that literally. Lord Byron's only speech in the House of Lords was defending the followers of Ned Ludd, who were smashing the mechanical looms coming up in industrial England in the 1830s, on the theory that the technology would put people out of work. Back then, in the 1830s, people thought technology would put us out of work. They were, of course, wrong then, just as the neo-Luddites are wrong now. And Ada understood that because she traveled around industrial England and saw how punch cards were instructing the looms to make beautiful patterns. And she had a friend named Charles Babbage who was making a numerical calculator. And she came up with a notion and published in a scientific journal, somewhat unusual for women in the 1830s, this idea that by using punch cards, Babbage's machine, calculating machine, could, as Ada put it, do more than just numbers, could do anything that could be notated in symbols. Could do words, could do music, could do patterns, could do art, could do writing, could do calculations. In other words, she came up with the notion of a general-purpose computer run by punch cards that could be programmed, and she even writes a program showing how you'd use the punch cards to instruct the machine to do different things. She had one caveat at the end of her article, which is machines like this will be able to do everything noted in symbols. They'll be able to, as I said, art, music, words. The one thing they will never be able to do is be creative. They will only follow instructions. It'll be up to the humans to be the creative partner, the innovative partner. That lasted for about 100 years, until exactly 100 years after she publishes it, in which Alan Turing publishes a paper called On Computable Numbers, makes reference to Ada Lovelace, and actually gives mathematical formalism to the notion of the general-purpose computer. I wanted, when I wrote my book, The Innovators, to make Ada famous, which I hope I did a little bit, and also make Alan Turing famous. Unfortunately, right before my book came out, Benedict Cumberbatch played him in a movie called The Imitation Game, so nobody remembers I had anything to do with Alan Turing. But Turing, in his paper, after he breaks the German code at Bletchley Park, writes the paper called The Imitation Game, and the main part of that paper is called Ada Lovelace's Objection. The objection that machines will never be creative, they'll never be able to think. And Turing comes up with the imitation game to see if that's true. We now call it the Turing test. You put a machine and a human in a different room, send in questions, and if the machine and the human's answers are indistinguishable, then you have no real reason, no empirical reason to say the machine isn't thinking, it's not creative. I think that's not a very good test. Most philosophers would say that doesn't make sense. But even if you believe that that's a good test, one of the interesting things is no computer has really passed that test. Every year somebody tries to gimmick or game the whole Turing game system. But in the end, the combination of human creativity combined with machine processing power, such as Google, which is an algorithm to combine all the judgments people make on their websites and combine them and correlate them so that it can answer many questions. That combination of human creativity and processing power has grown exponentially faster than the power of machines alone. So there will be people probably at this conference who talk about a singularity when machines will be able to leave us behind and think without us. But for those of us who are optimists and look at the data points, that combination of human creativity and machine processing power every decade, whether it's my new Apple Watch or my new way of using Google, it's all a combination of the creativity of humans that makes it work. The second notion I wanted to talk about, besides the connection of arts and sciences, and by the way, that's something every great innovator in history has done. I mean, you can start, if you just want to go only as far back as Leonardo da Vinci, you can look at the beautiful anatomical drawings of him drawing every single nerve in the face as he dissects a cadaver, and every single muscle that moves the lips at the same time as he's painting the Mona Lisa. And you realize he doesn't make a big distinction between art and science. In fact, Vitruvian Man, his man standing in the circle in the square, is that art? Is that science? No, it's a symbol of the connection of art and science. And all the way through to Steve Jobs, whenever he launched a product, it would always be a slide at the end of the show that said arts, technology. And he said that's the intersection where we stand, because we know that's where creativity comes from. But that also comes from collaboration. We biographers distort history a little bit. We sometimes make it seem like there's a guy or a gal who goes into a garage or a garret or a dorm room and comes out with a light bulb moment, and that's innovation. No, it doesn't work that way. Innovation works in teams even when it's the original Apple computer or the Macintosh or the original computer. Some guy tried to do it all alone in Iowa State, but he couldn't get it working because he didn't have a team. But John Mauchly drove out to Iowa State on his journeys all over the country to figure out how to build the first great electronic computer. Picked up ideas from the guy at Iowa State, from Grace Hopper and Howard Aiken up at Harvard, from Stibbets, who was working at Bell Labs, and collaborates. People, if you're lawyers, you call that intellectual property theft. But if you're an innovator, you call that collaboration. And it's like a bumblebee bringing pollen back. And when they finally get to University of Pennsylvania, Mauchly says, before we can build a computer, we have to build a team. And he gets 6 great women mathematicians, because women had not yet been told they couldn't do math. And so there were more women getting PhDs in math in the 1930s than there were a generation later. And so he has 6 great women programmers, great engineers, great designers, and they make ENIAC, which is the first electronic computer. Likewise, when you talk about the other great invention of our time, the internet, with all due respect to Al Gore, nobody knows who invented it. Why? Because it was invented by a team. A group of people at the Pentagon decided that they wanted to connect all these computers that had now sprung up so people could share and collaborate. And what do? Being, great research universities, they do what all research universities do. They delegate the task to their graduate students. And so you had 30 graduate students who had to figure out how we're going to network these computers together. They come up with a packet-switched idea where the packets scurry through various nodes with headers on them and know how to recombine. And they design it in a way that has ingrained in the DNA the collaboration that ends up being incentivized by the internet. In other words, each and every node has power. It's not like there's one central switch. It's not like there's a group of hubs, like an airline network or a phone network would have. It's all sorts of nodes, as many as you want, and each has power to store, forward, and create packets and send them scurrying. And if any part of the network goes down or somebody tries to suppress it, the packets just scurry around it. They know how to route around censorship or messes in the system. And in doing it, the metaphor is they're doing it that way. The 30 people creating it, there's no top-down hierarchy. Even though they're working for the Pentagon and they keep waiting for some colonel or worse yet, a general to come from the Pentagon and say, no, here's the way we want you to do it. The Pentagon isn't paying much attention. So these graduate students come up every day in their meetings and discussions with what are the protocols, what are the rules for this internet, what's it going to be? And Steve Crocker is the youngest of them, So he gets to take notes, and he wants to make sure that it's collaborative. So instead of calling each decision they make or idea they have a proposal, or worse yet, a protocol or a rule or a regulation, like here's how you put an address header and here's how you make the packet recombined, he called them requests for comment because he felt that would make it more open, everybody feel more collaborative. So all the way through, the beginnings of the design of the internet just come from the RFC process, request for comment, and it builds up until there's a consensus on each request for comment of how they're going to do things. That's really cool, and that was like in the late 60s, but what's particularly cool is 50 years later, that's still how we're creating the internet. If you think about it, nobody's designing this internet, but it's still being done by the RFC process, request for comment. People are involved. People do it for free. They send things out. We're up to number 7,900 in the request for comment process. When we wrote about that at Time magazine, we wrote in the 1990s that it was done that way to prevent the Russians from being able to destroy it in a Soviet nuclear attack, because you can't take out the central node. You take out one packet or a group of packets or a group of nodes, and it routes around any damage. And so it's unable to just be brought down as if there were one switch controlling it. We got, Time magazine said it was done that way. We got a letter from Steve Crocker, I'd never heard of at the time. This graduate student or former graduate student said, no, we didn't do it because of a Russian nuclear attack. We were graduate students, don't forget. We were avoiding the draft. We were not working for the Pentagon. We were doing it so no grand authority, no people would have total control of this. Time magazine was arrogant back then, I know because I worked there, and refused to print his letter, said we have better sources than you. And I had forgotten about that until I interviewed Crocker for this book, and I said, who is it? He told me the story. I said, oh, yeah. So I went back to Nancy Gibbs, who runs Time magazine, and said, have somebody get me that folder from back in the 90s when we did that story. I want to know who the better source was. Well, the better source was a guy named Steve Lukasich, who was the head of ARPA at the Pentagon. And he said, yeah, the graduate students think they're doing it for their own reasons, but the way we're getting money from the Pentagon is by selling it as something that would survive a Russian nuclear attack. So you tell Crocker that he was on the bottom and I'm on the top, and so he didn't really know what was happening. So I did. I went to a coffee shop in Bethesda where Crocker lives, tells him the story, and he strokes his chin and he says, you tell Lukasich he was on the top and I was on the bottom, so he didn't know what was happening. And that's the whole point of peer-to-peer collaborative creativity that is ingrained in the DNA of the internet. And finally, there's a notion of curiosity. Been working a little bit on Leonardo da Vinci, because I always believe in the books I write that it's important to connect the arts and the sciences, which is how we began, and that if there's a great exemplar of that in human history, it's probably Leonardo. And so I'm reading his notebooks, and his notebooks have questions in it that are questions that seem so simple, like, why is the sky blue? Look outside, the sky's blue. Well, wait, the air is clear. What's causing that? You and I probably wondered about that a little as a kid, but now, you go out in the mountain and say, oh, look, the sky's blue, but you don't say why. A whole codex of pages owned by Bill Gates now at his house, the Codex Leicester. There's Leonardo looking at molecules of water vapor, how they get evaporated, how light hits it, how that light scatters, why the sky is blue. It reminded me of another thing I had seen in Albert Einstein's notebooks. It's not in 1504, which is when Leonardo is writing. This is when Einstein's a pretty older man, 1920s. He writes, why is the sky blue? And he goes further than Leonardo. He has Rayleigh's formula. He knows how the spectrum of light, blue gets scattered less than the red lights. He explains it all. But it's that curiosity. Leonardo could have painted the Mona Lisa with that beautiful blue sky without knowing why the sky was blue, but he needed to know. He wanted to know. And he did it not for a practical purpose. He did it just because he was curious. In fact, the most astonishingly delightful line in Leonardo's notebooks to me is just right in the middle. He's doing things. He says, describe this, figure how birds do this, and fly, all these practical things he wanted to do. And then he wrote, describe the tongue of the woodpecker. I think I might even call my book, Describe the Tongue of the Woodpecker. Because that's a hard thing to do. I mean, have you seen a woodpecker? And, but it's like he wanted to know. If that thing's going like that, what does the tongue look like? I don't know if he ever, he was a vegetarian. He used to free captured birds. I'm not sure whether he dissected it. We don't have it in the notebooks. But just to be curious like that, once again, Einstein did it. Einstein is given a compass when he's age 6 years old, and he's mesmerized about how the needle twitches and points north. Now, he goes out and he turns it. Nothing is touching that needle. And you and I remember getting a compass when we were 6, right? And we go, wow, look, the needle, it turns north. And a minute later, we're, oh, look, a dead squirrel. And we're on to something else. To his deathbed, he is curious. Why does that compass needle twitch and point north? And over, he's looking at like Maxwell's equations, which describe an electromagnetic force field and how those light waves travel, an electromagnetic wave travels. And he comes up with the notion that if you're moving really fast, your perception of how they travel will always, be the same. The speed of light's always the same, but time will be different depending on how you travel. Because if you're traveling really fast to one clock, it'll look different than if you're traveling really fast to the other clock. What looks synchronized will be different. So he comes up with the special theory of relativity. Beautiful theory, all based out of this compass needle. What's happening here? What's this force field? But then he wants to attach all the force fields together. And he does another thought experiment. I say this because we're on the 100th anniversary this month of him starting to talk about this, which is if you're in a falling elevator with, and with no windows, you'll feel weightless. You let something go, it sort of floats by you because you're falling at an accelerated rate. But if you're in that same elevator and there's no gravity in outer space and you're accelerating upward, you'll feel your feet being pressed to the floor. You drop something, it'll fall at an accelerated rate. In other words, you'll feel like you're in a gravitational field, even if you're out of space, accelerating. And from that, he comes up with the notion, just pure curiosity leads him to the notion that gravity and acceleration are equivalent. They're the same thing. So there must be some fabric of the cosmos that makes imagination, with that imagination, that fabric of the cosmos that explains acceleration and gravity. And with that great curious leap, he comes up with the most beautiful theory in all of science in the fall of 1915, 100 years ago, the general theory of relativity. So with that, let me thank everybody at the Brain Lab and understand the power of curiosity, collaboration, and creativity. Thank you.